Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the eighth book in the NORAC series on international education and development. My name is Chanung Baek. I am the academic director of NORAC, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, let me briefly highlight a few technical aspects of the event. Due to the size of the room, all participants' cameras and microphones are turned off. And for our speakers, please turn on your cameras when you are speaking and during the Q&A. I would like to also note that this event is going to be recorded and will be made available publicly for those who could not join us today live. Live captioning is available in multiple languages. You can enable captions and select your preferred language by clicking on the Show Captions icon. If you do not see Show Captions icon on the bottom of the Zoom interface right now, you can click the More icon in order to see the Show Captions icon. For the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A box. There is a separate Q&A box. You can share your questions. The authors are also very welcome to respond directly in the Q&A during the session because we may not be able to address all questions live. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat box to contact the host, and we will do our best to assist you. So let me briefly outline today's program. We will begin with opening remarks from the director of the Geneva Graduate Institute, Marilo Salas. This will be followed by a short video highlighting the book, and we will then hear reflections from three distinguished commentators, after which the authors will respond. We will conclude with a Q&A session. And with this, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Director Marilo Salas for her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Changwon, dear all. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to say a few words at the beginning of this book launch organized by NORAG. And I really would like to thank you, Shanwang, but also Gita and Moira for having me at the beginning of this session. There are at least three reasons why I'm particularly delighted to be with you today. First, because the work of NORAG has never been more necessary and important than today. If anything, the current state of our world shows that we need to fight for education and that we need to do that together, collectively, collaboratively, at the global level. And this is what NORAG is all about. The state of our world shows us what happens when we forget the role education has in the building up of social contracts, whether it's nationally, but also locally and transnationally. The state of our world also shows us what happens when we forget the importance of education as the foundation of any healthy democracy. We need to work and to fight together. We need to prepare the ground so that when the current war zeitgeist abates, because it will abate, we are ready to rebuild an educational project that carries the project of a reinvented social contract and of a renovated vision of peace. Peace being the highest form of human security, let's never forget that. 2 years ago, the International Bureau of Education celebrated its centenary, and our own Geneva Graduate Institute will celebrate its own centenary next year. The conviction that led to the creation of our institute, but also of the International Bureau of Education, was that the building of a longer-term project of international collaboration for peace could not develop without a strong role for education. Maybe it is time to revive and to rejuvenate such a project. And I believe that both NORAG and the Institute can have an important role to play here. A second reason I'm happy to be here is that I'm looking very much forward to learning more about the book that will be discussed today, Data for Accountability in Education, Global Trends in School Reform. I'm intrigued in particular by the notions of accountability and responsibility. Are those the same notions? And the obvious background is naturally accountability to whom? For what? Who defines to whom schools have to be accountable to and on which ground? And I'm definitely looking forward to hearing the answers on that of the authors. Lastly, but certainly not least, I'm really delighted to be here to give a particular warm welcome to our commentators, John Meyer, Patrick Legales, and Jane Gingrich. John, I really need to start with you, and this is not going to be a formalistic welcome. I met John exactly 26 years ago in Stanford when I was still a young scholar. And in a matter of weeks, John has become a mentor and a friend. And through the years, he has very generously accompanied me intellectually to the different paths that my work has taken. I haven't seen you in too long, John. I can't say how much I owe you. And one thing is sure is that it's a lot. And I only wish that I could welcome you physically at the Institute here in Geneva. Patrick, you're next. Patrick and I met later, but we have our own common history. Beyond the intellectual proximity and the shared intellectual networks, we've also gone through a parallel path as deans of two graduate schools within Sciences Po Paris. This has led to shared frustrations, but also, happy moments, and the comfort that came from being able to feel that we were sharing issues and trying to find solutions to them together. Being a dean and a director, I can say, can feel lonely at times and frustrating. So sharing this has helped a lot and created a long-lasting bond. Jane, I'm sorry that I do not have a similar personal past bond to share, but my very warm welcome, obviously, to you too. I want to thank the three of you very sincerely for having accepted to play this important role of commentators. I will finish here. I'm only looking forward to the discussion, and I wish all of you a very nice session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Salas, for highlighting the importance of education and sharing your interest in the book, and also for sharing your warm welcome to all commentators. We will now move to a short video highlighting the book contents for the further discussion, and it will be now played.
When we got together as a team of authors, we tried not to be another echo chamber where authors amplify each other's voices and perspectives, but we chose each other to complement each other. So some of us look at the macro level, some at the meso level, and some at the macro level. And this is the contribution of our book to research on data for accountability purposes.
In Chapter 2, I trace emphases on accountability and responsibility in education reforms around the world. I do this using the World Education Reform Database, which is a publicly available resource that has descriptions of close to 15,000 education policies from countries around the world. So a key finding of the chapter is that as datafication intensifies from the mid-2000s on, emphases on responsibility fall off dramatically in education policies. In contrast, emphases on accountability continue to increase. A key implication is that datafication contributes to the hollowing out of notions of responsibility for education outcomes.
In this chapter, I examine how large-scale assessments and related accountability policies evolve in educational systems. As several chapters in the book show, accountability and assessments have spread widely in education, but their design and trajectory vary quite significantly. And perhaps more importantly, they also change continuously within the same educational system over time. So the central question I ask is, what explains different accountability configurations and pathways beyond obvious common reform pressures? To explore this, I adopt an instrumentation perspective. This is a theoretical perspective that focuses on three main dimensions. The first one is the framing of the policy problems that instruments are expected to address. Second, how do new instruments interact with existing policies and produce new policy mixes? And third, how policy feedback loops and instrument constituencies become key mechanisms in shaping policy trajectories. In fact, one of the contributions of this chapter is developing this framework. Empirically, I apply the framework to the cases of performance-based accountability in Chile, Norway, and Catalonia. And I show how the different components of the instrumentation framework interact and effectively shape policy pathways in the three systems.
My chapter looks at the transfer that is rarely discussed, the transfer from ministries of finance to ministries of education. We always think that all education reform start in our sector, but we forget that many reforms started out as a public administration reform and then were handed over to line ministries, including ministries of education. And when we take it one level up to the macro level, we can see how the OECD and the World Bank were really instrumental in spreading those reforms. Not only ministries of finance reforms or public administration reforms, but then also education reforms. And this is what my chapter contributes to this book.
The chapter I wrote in this book examines reforms associated with public accountability with a particular focus on assessments. We coded over 15,000 national education reforms from the World Education Reform Database, which was developed by our research team at Stanford University and the University of Toronto. The main argument of this paper is that assessments are an indispensable and influential component of reform efforts, affecting student learning, teacher performance, education planning, and strategic directions of national education systems. I'd like to highlight some key findings of this paper. First, we observe a rise in assessment reforms relative to other types of education reforms. The study also reveals that topology of assessment reforms have changed over time. There are also assessment reforms that reference other countries through rankings and knowledge exchanges. Also, there's greater reference to assessment reforms associated with students and teachers. This reveals that there's greater standard setting and oversight of student competency and teacher performance over time.
And I present chapter 6 of this book. Building on the overall focus of the book on data for accountability, this final chapter looks at intergovernmental organizations and how they contribute to the field of education. Let me highlight 3 main points. First, out of 350 IOs currently around, 30 of them deal with education policy today. While UNESCO, the OECD, or the World Bank are widely known as education IOs, the majority of them, namely 20, work on a regional level. Second, this number of IOs dealing with education policy has continuously grown since 1945, but plateaued at its current height in the early 2000s, actually very similar to IOs active in other policy fields. And third, all these IOs try to influence the global or regional discourses on education through policy documents, but only very few of them have other tools such as binding conventions or funding mechanisms at their disposal.
I hope you enjoyed that brief introduction to the book. I will now turn to our commentators who will share their reflections on the contents of the book. And it is my great pleasure to first invite Jane Gingrich from the University of Oxford. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to turn my timer on so I don't take too long. Okay. So let me begin by saying I really, it's a real genuine pleasure to be here and comment on this book because I think it is an important and timely contribution to the study of comparative education. So the field has not lacked in many ways of critical accounts of datafication. We have rich sociological work on surveillance, the performative effects of measurement, the way standardized testing operates, sometimes for good and sometimes for more sort of disciplinary reasons. But what we've really lacked, I think, is both a systematic empirical account of kind of how this happened, the political and institutional processes through which data became a dominant instrument of educational governments, both globally and locally, and why these processes took the forms that they did. And this book really provides that account, and it does so with a scope and rigor that is genuinely impressive. So in Ria Kichma's chapter on the rise of assessments, data for assessments, what we see is just a tremendous mapping of the way in which these data-driven policies have emerged. And I think that comes out through all of the chapters and really highlights the extent of these trends. So I want to point to kind of three things that I think come out of the book that are really important to take seriously. And then time dependent, I have two kind of critical pushes that I want to go on the concept of accountability itself. So the first major contribution is what I would call it's the seriousness across the chapters of taking temporality seriously. So in Gita Steiner-Kamsey's chapter, she makes this argument very effectively in that there's been a sort of a layering of datafication over time. So something that frustrates people that work inside education systems, the question of sort of why accountability often feels so impossibly overdetermined, why schools and teachers face seemingly contradictory demands simultaneously. And what this chapter really shows is that they do. And it's because they're still subject to sort of welfare state compliance logics, new public management market accountability logics, interventionist state standard logics, and now the kind of engaged state social accountability logics, all in parallel. And so what we see is this sort of infrastructure of each era alive and this accumulation of sort of layered datafication as a structural feature rather than a policy failure in some sense. And really bringing that forward, I think, is a conceptual advance that comes through the book as a whole and connects it to the broader institutionalist work on path dependence. A second major contribution at a more theoretical level is the disaggregation of levels of analysis. And the authors are very self-conscious about the way in which they've combined kind of macro, meso, and micro levels of analysis. And both Gita and Kirsten's chapters take a particular take on this, which I think collectively, along with the other chapters, really add up to something very important and insightful in the way in which there's this intersection between ministries of finance and the sort of global IOs in education. So standards accounts of education policy often focus on education ministries as actors, education departments, researchers, and so on. But what these chapters show is that the drivers of datafication have not just been the education sector, but public administration reform driven by finance ministries and their counterparts in the OECD and World Bank. And much of the kind of action in education ministries are partly downstream of this process, not at its center. And this requires a kind of methodological orientation in terms of how we think about both the measurement and actors in education policies. A third major contribution of the book is the empirical documentation of what Patricia Bromley calls kind of accountability without responsibility. So through a content analysis of the policy documents in the World Education Reform Database, Bromley shows that accountability language expanded since the 1990s, but the language of autonomy and responsibility has contracted. And this is not just a kind of discursive observation, it also points to a kind of structural transformation in how education systems are governed, from systems that delegated professional authority alongside accountability obligations to those that demand reporting and compliance, often without granting the autonomy that genuine responsibility requires. And I think this brings us to kind of this attention to feedback loops that comes through all the chapters, or in some cases, their sort of systematic absence. The book observes that data systems proliferate while data use stagnates, that international organizations produce reports that governments often ignore, that late adopters join the reform movements for symbolic reasons without learning from early negative experiences. And all of these point to, in some cases, governance that confuses the production of accountability information with the exercise of accountability. And this matters because one of the defining features of modern datafication, in contrast to kind of earlier attempts, for instance, thinking like back to Jim Scott's work on state legibility projects, is precisely that measurement can now alter behavior in real time. So if you go to kind of the way Jim Scott thought about legibility, and creating kind of cadastral maps that described a territory and then kind of fell behind it, contemporary data systems feed back into behavior of those they measure continuously. But as the book shows, these feedback loops have become in many respects decoupled from genuine accountability in many cases. And so this is kind of where I want to push on and hear a little bit more. So my remaining 5 minutes, or 4 minutes, I want to push on the concept of accountability a little bit more and what it might actually mean. And this is not a criticism. I think it's a set of open questions, but that come out of the very richness of the book itself. So it gives us an exceptional account of how data for accountability has spread and what it's produced. What I push on is sort of how do we think about accountability itself and how do we what what is it? What is accountability and for whom? So the book's concept of accountability in part draws on the policy documents it analyzes. So when Bromley tracks the rise of accountability in the World Education Reform Database, she's tracking the diffusion in part of a word and the conventions attached to that word through international policy discourse. And that's valuable. And I think, but I think that it means that in a sense, the book is measuring the spread of accountability discourse using the categories of that discourse itself. And to get outside the circle and to think about what this means, maybe in a more political sense, it'd be useful to kind of compare how that language interacts with more sort of different theoretical anchors. So I want to suggest two anchors, each of which kind of opens different research directions. So the first comes from principal-agent frameworks in political science. And specifically, if you think about something like Clara Strom's work on delegation chains in democratic governance. Strom argues that democratic accountability requires traceable singular chains from citizens through elected representatives and the deliverers of public service. Now, the book largely avoids the language of principals and agents or delegation logics or ex post monitoring. But I think this vocabulary is hiding in parts of the argument. So if we take each link of Strom's delegation chains, principals face two problems: adverse selection and moral hazard that prevents agents from exploiting their informational advantages once delegated. Data systems are often considered responses to these problems. And the question of whether they're the right responses depends on how we conceptualize these accountability problems. So for Strom, multiple competing principles which exist in an education system generate not accountability, but strategic ambiguity. And if we take this kind of a framework, it actually reframes what Bromley calls decoupling. Rather than a policy failure, it's a kind of predictable equilibrium of a governance design that progressively adds new principles, IOs, finance ministries, parents, et cetera, without retiring old ones. And then as a result, schools responsible to everyone in a meaningful sense, they become responsible to no one. Now, in Strom's model, the ultimate principle is always the citizen. It's a democratic process. And so when we think about accountability from this framework, much of the sort of trends analyzed here, in which policies come from the OECD or World Bank, suggest a kind of subversion of the kind of ultimate accountability logic between democratic citizens and their governments. And in this case, if we go to Tony Verger's chapter, what he documents then is not just a sort of selective translation of accountability logics, but a different form of subversion that's happening through teachers' unions or other actors at the local level. Now, if we take a different way of thinking about accountability, one that's less about chains of delegation or strict kind of principal agent problems, but one that maybe is closer to what Bovens calls accountability as a virtue, we interpret these trends in very different ways. Accountability as a virtue is a normative disposition, the professional ethics, internal sense of obligations, and reporting to those that it serves. Bovens' key insights also map onto Bromley's findings in that the expansion of accountability mechanisms as a mechanism can crowd out accountability as a virtue. When external monitoring intensifies, internal professional judgment atrophies. But it casts a very different light on Tony's chapters, in which the three cases actually become analytically rich in new ways. Here, Norway's relative resistance to high-stakes consequential accountability becomes a form of maintenance of a more formative form of a professional assessment or accountability as a virtue that is a different interpretation than the sort of strong principal agent delegation model. So I've run out of time, but what I wanted to say is that these questions about what is accountability, how do we think about data within these frameworks really come out of this very rich book. And what it raises is an incredible comparative research agenda that's not just about explaining the adoption of accountability systems, but also the effects of different configurations and the mechanisms that they create. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for your comment. helping us to think about different dimensions and frameworks around accountability. And I'm pretty sure the authors will be able to engage further with those insights in their responses later. I will now turn to Patrick Lugalis from Sciences to share his reflections. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to discuss this very exciting book. And I can only join by saying that reading the book was a treat. It's a real tour de force. It's a real contribution to this field of global comparative education studies. And like Jane, I was very impressed by the mix of conceptual discussion and theoretical discussion together with, this is a book, a research book with very, very solid research from different angles. And that's immensely enjoyable in this field. So thank you for producing such a great book. Let me emphasize, I'm not a specialist about the education field, so I am a bit on the side from that point of view. And I'm a European, I do comparative public policy work, so I will comment from that point of view, and I'm sure John will do on education in a very, very strong way. Let me start by two small observations. Number one, I will not come back on all the strength of the book. I think it has been already put forward by Jane, and I share all the strong points. I would rather raise questions for the discussion and maybe some little points that I'd like the author to put forward a bit more. So two things to start with. Number one, this book does two things, really. On the one hand, we see the rise of accountability and data in the field of education. But in parallel, there's a whole discussion about globalization of public policy and data accountability beyond education. And sometimes those two things are mixed and require some clarification. And second, I could not just preventing myself from thinking it's quite a paradox in this book in a way, because in a way, what we see in lots of opinion surveys and research, including the countries I know, is that more and more people just don't trust those figures anymore. And we see a growing number of social groups, for instance, connected to populism movement, that are just fed up with all these figures and they don't want to hear about that. And on the other end, we have this ever expansion of datafication. And I think at some point it would be interesting to think, what does it mean for the field of education? Now, my small list of points to start and to increase, to go for a discussion. The first one is maybe a regret of a title. This is not the most exciting title. I think to promote the book, you might have, think about a different title. And my frustration also not to have a little conclusion. I think, I was missing a little bit a conclusion at the end. But these are minor points that are really completely marginal in what we are discussing here. In a way, my first point is to follow what Jane has been saying eloquently about accountability. I was wondering whether it would be interesting at some point, and that was missing a conclusion maybe, to think that you are connecting immediately accountability and data. But what is interesting also is that we see forms of accountability developing that are not related to data. And by contrast, I see a lot of data production that is not connected to accountability. So where I was maybe less completely convinced by the book is this complete connection that you start, even as a normative point, as your research angle, which is perfectly fine. But in many ways, when I look at the data being produced and the database you're using, I cannot resist but thinking that a lot of this data is produced for other reasons, and accountability being maybe one among others. And because you concentrate on discourse, of course, you emphasize accountability. But with my critical eye, I cannot resist thinking that, of course, if you are an international organization or if you are a national organization, when a lot of data is being produced, you have to justify all these activities. And, I know lots of consultants, they spend their work, their life writing reports for international organizations, and they need to put all the right words. So, of course, when you produce data, you have to legitimate yourself and you have to put accountability, accountability, accountability. Whether it's really central to this production of data process or not remains an empirical question. And I wonder whether you could elaborate a bit more on disconnecting data and accountability and think about these connections between them and maybe take a more critical view. On following this accountability issue as well, I was thinking that what I like in the book is also the way you emphasize in different chapters the idea that the place, this displacement of the burden of accountability. And maybe you could do even more with that. This game around who is going to be responsible. You mentioned that, but you mentioned placing the burden of accountability. I think it's a wonderful turn of phrase, and you could have done more because there are lots of things in the books, which is really very interesting. My second point is to emphasize what you do with school autonomy and with accountability. And you make a lot about the neoliberal framework and what is possibly changing today. Let me emphasize, just to push you a little bit, a couple of points around that. Number one, what you describe as neoliberalism is just blunt liberalism. So I'm part of this. I wrote a paper one day called "Don't Stretch a Good Idea Too Far When You Use Neoliberalism." And in the book, you're not very careful with that. And I wonder whether it would be interesting to be more precise. Privatization, delegation, responsibility, that's liberalism. So I have a more precise definition of neoliberalism. And I think there's a bit of confusion in parts of the book where you use a lot of that. And I'm not completely convinced. The second thing is when you mention school autonomy with accountability, in a way, I cannot resist coming back to Weber. And I think you make some very interesting notation when you mention that we see a more I think it's Gita, more surveillance capitalism going on at the moment. And I think it's a general point which goes much beyond education. And maybe in the book sometimes, although you try to avoid that, you could go beyond education. And it's not just Ministry of Finance influencing education. Sometimes it can be some other sectors influencing education. And you have interdependence between different policies. But I think what you are really showing in is not just the iron cage that Weber identified, but you see, when you identified school autonomy with accountability, it's in my language, freer actors, more rules, which is this making of a forms of glass cage. We have more and more transparency and more data that allows also for more and more forms of control. And I think this tension between empowerment and control connected to datafication is present in several chapters, in all of them actually, in one way or another. And I wonder whether you could play a bit more with that, with which dynamics and the combination between the two, and whether we see this form of a glass cage, and whether you interpret that in terms of empowerment for some groups, but maybe more control for some others. My fourth point is maybe to ask you, that's of course, my bias, probably being French, you're obsessed with the state, but you mentioned a lot of things about the state in your analysis altogether. Also, the migration of authority to international organizations or at the local level, but also you say a lot about the way some policy making and type of state is always, Gita in particular mentioned the engaged state and the intervention state in different forms. What I read coming from the sociology of the state is very clear view. We see two contradictory views in the chapters, but I think it's not contradictory. That's what we see empirically. On the one hand, we see forms of denationalization of political authority in the field of education. Very clearly done. Jane has written about that as well. It's very clear. On the other end, what is interesting is that in order to do reform, you use data to re-centralize and to try to regain some political capacity. And I think it would be interesting at some point that maybe in a future paper, you try to bring those two things together and you try to say something about reshaping of the state in relation to those two things. In my work with Desmond King, we emphasize that national states now are accountable to three groups: the citizen, international organizations, EU and other countries, and firms and financial organizations. And I think there's something there in the book that would be interesting maybe to put forward. My fifth point is to come back on instrumentation, which is, of course, things I do, and I think it's a very good case, and you show very well how when the goals are too vague, you use instruments to try to do something. And I like very much what you show on the resistance, Tony, in particular, in your chapter. But what is surprising in the different chapters of the book is that this idea of resistance, but even more than that, conflict around this data is not really present. In a way, the logic of instrumentation is to emphasize resistance, but also conflict about the framing or conflict about the choice of instrument. And you seem to be a little bit shy, if I may say so, in some of the chapters on these dynamics. And maybe the database doesn't help. But I think the logic of thinking in terms of instrumentation is to think about the power relations, and it's present, but I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit more. And then to finish that, to conclude on my last minute, my little frustration in the book, there's only one, is that we are in a world of international organizations, national governments, professional organizations, but surprisingly, we see very little about firms, consultant, and private sector. And in all the world of public policy I know, including education, I see both the large GAFAM, both the financialization, both private entrepreneur. So in the world of policy entrepreneur in education, there's a blind spot in the book in a way, maybe. And my impression is that part of this datification process is also pushed forward by those who are using, Palantir, the American firm, is not yet massively present in education, but they are already in health. And maybe they are in education, I just don't know. But they are becoming a major actor in reading. So going to AI and big data is just completely changing that. So I miss a little bit firms, consultant, finance, organization, and all the private firms and private organization that are also policy entrepreneur and that can use that in a systematic way. So I wonder whether you think it's an important part or it's not an important part. And my last point is paying tribute to Desrosières, one of the big scholar on quantification. And in his last papers before he died, he emphasized that this quantification logic is taken really new dimension with intelligence, artificial intelligence. But also, he says that the more datification you have, the more you have to think about commensuration, meaning what is going on, what do we measure that doesn't make sense, and by contrast, what is not measured with the measure we use. And I was wondering whether for you cannot do everything, okay? But for your project in the future, it would be interesting to try to think about the limits of what has been done in terms of datification, what is not measured, of course, but also the number of measures. We know that, and we measure in some other domain, that a lot of measures are useless and used by no one. So I wonder whether you have such a formidable group of people doing such a fantastic empirical work, you might contribute to thinking about the limits and a more critical eye on this datification. Thank you very much. Great book, and a formidable team, very, very complimentary chapter. The book is a great success. Thank you. Very enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for sharing your comments, particularly around the areas that the authors could explore further, also beyond education in particular. It is now my pleasure to invite John Mayer from Stanford University. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to comment on a very interesting book. Congratulate the authors for having done so much interesting research. And I guess a book will, I think, influence research in the field a good deal. Yeah, the focus obviously is the long-term rationalization of education on a global scale. The datafication is one word for it, but in a way, it's important to keep track of the extent to which this has happened. A couple of the chapters mention the enormous just expansion of data of all kinds. One chapter, I think, speaks of 100 variables that are available here. But it's more than that. Massive expansion. And I guess I can illustrate that a little bit. I remember many, many years ago, back in the 1950s, sitting in a graduate seminar at the University of Colorado, and the professor came in with, Judson Pearson was his name, with one of these, the first edition of a handbook. And we had never seen anything like that. And he told us, there's a lot of data in here, and what can you do with it? And so we set to think what we could do with it and did nothing useful or intelligent, and were not able to do anything. And that characterized the field, the initial efforts at some sort of use of quantitative data in this field back in the 50s and to some extent the 60s, as in other fields of comparative research. By and large, it was a failure. And by the 1970s, I think people were learning to use such kind of data, both domestically and internationally, with more effective capacity. The failure at the time was often attributed to the data were bad. And that's why nothing useful came out of research with them. It turned out that wasn't true, but it was a powerful myth. And even basic data on enrollment in different countries were treated as made up. We starting a project in that field in the late 60s. We were surrounded by that and finally sent a graduate student to Paris to study how bad are these data. And it turned out education enrollment data are pretty good. The problem is the denominator. You had no idea how many people there were. They would fly over in an airplane and estimate the number of people in an African village and guess how many, that would be the denominator. But demography is a high prestige field and education lower, so everyone blamed the education data. The graduate student, after suffering for a summer having to eat French food, come back and said, this is all okay. The point here is, of course, that this expansion, this datafication process has several commentators, and in the book, it's not unique to the field of education, but characterizes every sector of society in which you have massive amounts of data worldwide with standardized pictures of massive numbers of variables. I'm thinking of just a couple of years ago trying to do research on a particular issue and had to struggle with one data set. And then a graduate student came back and it turned out that there were 17 data sets on this general issue. That just a huge expansion of what goes on. Obviously, this characterizes post-World War II society, liberal, increasingly neoliberal, and that the datafication in general should be seen in ways that Miller and Rose, following Foucault, called governmentality. And obviously, for every expansion of these data, there are critics complaining that they are relocating power in the system. But the big story is just massive expansion. And it clearly substitutes it. You can imagine what things would look like if we had a real French-like state in the world. It would be much simpler, much less data, much more direct bureaucratic control. Datafication is something one does to other people. One doesn't do it to oneself necessarily. So this is a process that occurs in all through society. Obviously, this is especially characteristic of education. And I think there is a second factor beyond the general world datafication process. is the centrality of education in this model of the world, which, as it becomes important, you get more data, more efforts at sometimes global policy change. And you have in education as well as other fields, you can have, there's a journal, Global Social Policy, as if, and of course, as these chapters of this book demonstrate, there are many international organizations are in the business of doing that in education. But the rise of education is extremely important. There's a nice paper by Anya Jacobi years ago in the Comparative Education Review, the extent to which political parties in, I think it was OECD countries, have education planks. Earlier they didn't, but education came to seem to be important, and so it becomes a thing parties have, as I will comment later if I have time. There's a question, how does that continue now in a modern post-liberal period, and whether or not education will seem so central, and therefore datafication pressures will be lowered. But that's part of a long history of mass education in particular, with religious functions and shifting toward more political ones by the 19th century and social and economic ones, as T.H. Marshall noted, in the 20th century. And now, now toward more person-centered notions of education, the rise of socio-emotional learning and such like matters, far removed from the original achievement test scores. And the question is, I'll come back to, will that continue in the contemporary period? So you have the general rationalization of society in a globalized period, and an intensive rationalization of education, and some question, this is what the main question I would have for the authors of the book, with the decline of liberal authority in the world, in the rise of opposition to it, what does that do to datafication? And one particular question is, will the subsequent measures increasingly include components of socio-emotional learning, things like that, in their attempt to comprehend, quantitatively comprehend educational systems? So the post-liberal, my real question here is, what do they anticipate happening to datafication in a period where there's more resistance to global liberalism? And there are movements for privacy. And you can resist filling out a questionnaire on privacy grounds, and that's a worldwide thing. In sub-Saharan Africa, you still have efforts to expand datafication, and there, in at least one West African country, there is a social movement, the right to be counted, because there are some exclusionary efforts in the system to exclude migrants of various kinds. And so they claim a general human right to be counted. If you move north a few miles, you get to Sweden, in which there is the right to not be counted. And that is a real social movement in the world. And I wondered what they think will look like. Homeschooling is one effort to escape some of those things. Privacy, the expansion of private education, and various efforts to move away from pseudo-objective notions of knowledge toward more subjective pictures in the teaching of history, of language, and so on. And all those are resistant. And I wondered if the authors think datafication will continue, or will there were all along efforts to stop it, and there was real opposition to the IEA and PISA data sets and those kinds of things. I remember a time, and I go back more years, some people, when the first efforts were made to get an American national test. And there was much resistance. And the resistance came from the backcountry members of Congress and who were concerned that a test would expose their incompetence. And so the founders of the test had to promise, and they created a new subfield of statistics to create an aggregate data set that was an adequate sample for scientific reasons. They'd want to do that. And to design it so that it was unanalyzable. That is a field to create useless data. And of course, as the discussion here has proceeded, many kinds of data are organized to be useless. And that was an amusing case. They finally overcame it, and there is a test where you can compare states. But that was, for a decade, that was the main opposition. Anyway, it's a great book, and I think its ideas apply beyond the field of education, and they apply especially to this dramatic liberal period of expanded datafication and expanded education. And I would ask the authors what they think about where this goes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing your reflection on the datafication trends and encouraging authors to think about the future of datafication, whether it will continue or what will happen to the datafication and so on. And with that, thank you so much to all three commentators for your insights and thoughtful and stimulating points. And we will now turn to the authors for their responses. It is my pleasure to welcome Gita Steiner-Kamsi, Patricia Bromley, Ria Kijima, Kirsten Martins, and Antoni Verger. And I think just as a beginning, as a first question, all three commentators pointed, and particularly the first two, pointed out the concept of accountability, right? How there are many dimensions to it and how there are many different ways to understand and explore it too. And since accountability is a core concept of the book, I think it might be helpful for us to start with that point. But at any point, feel free to engage with other points raised by the commentators. And I think perhaps as a first response, Tricia, do you mind going first, responding to this concept of accountability, encompassing different dimensions?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, thank you for hosting this book launch for us, and to our wonderful commentators. That was really thought-provoking discussion. So just on the specific question about meanings of accountability, my notes during the discussions were that it's very well taken, and an exciting area, I think, for future research in the field to really unpack forms of accountability to whom, for what, how much datafication actually overlaps with this issue of accountability, and how much data is used for other things. Maybe one particular dimension that I was interested in was this tension between the extent to which accountability measures are kind of a tool for empowerment versus a tool for control and surveillance. That dimension, I think, as a valuable area to explore is really important, in part because I think it might be the sort of key entry point into thinking about changing meanings of the term over time. So part of what I think our book does is to get at this issue of what is meant by accountability is likely different in different settings and is changing over time in some ways. So one way I think about this is that the surveillance, the sort of loose surveillance side of it, as linked to many big data practices, seems to be increasing over time. And can be both a kind of control and a kind of empowerment. And it likely takes very different forms in different kinds of government structures. So it came up a few times in the discussion that accountability can be sort of a tool for citizens ultimately in democratic societies. But at least in the data that I look at, some of these practices are highly, highly prevalent in very autocratic settings, and maybe even in our own, in the US, increasingly autocratic setting. So I think that, yeah, that's sort of a key. The changing meaning of accountability, I think, gives us leverage into thinking about the changing relationship or just the relationship between states and citizens under different contexts. So very loose, sorry, the ideas are so unstructured, but my reflections on this.
Shall I say something? Shall I continue, Channel?
As you raise your hand, I assume that you have a comment around this. Yes.
Yeah. So, wow, these comments were so helpful. We should always have comments in the middle of the process and not at the end of the book. All of them really stretch my thinking for sure. Just comment on 2 points that were made. One is almost like a normal distribution of trust in data. As John says, there was no trust in the 50s and 60s, even on enrollment figures. And now, and then maybe in the 90s with this era of neoliberalism, and I agree with Patrick that it is a historical period and we should recognize it as a historical period where there were conservative parties in power in the 90s and early 2000s. With high trust in that period, with the entry of the private sector and firms coming into the sector, and the move from input regulation to outcomes regulation and results-based management, and then eventually with the shift in political parties to standards-based regulation, a topic that Patrick wrote a lot about. And then now again, with the normal distribution after this peak in the 90s and early 2000s, now still, and I agree that data takes on a life of itself. It continues even though the trust in data dropped. And it dropped because there is this democratization. There's an overload of data. There's a democratization of expertise. And I think in education, maybe more than in any other field, we have a democratization of expertise. And it's a term that Sabine Mawson used, but also Gilles talks about the crisis of expertise. Once you have so much data, and there's disagreement on how to measure and how to interpret data, this creates a distrust in data because there's this overload. And what it creates is a distrust in data that we are at the current moment. And the question is, where does that lead us? And what does that mean for the role of the state? For me, that's a really important question. Another way of putting it is saying that social accountability of putting data in the hands of the citizen is a process of destatization. It is decreasing the power of the state to make data-based or evidence-based decision because the state is not the only authority anymore, or never was, but it definitely is not. With the move towards social accountability, there's a shift of power, and the state has lost power in justifying its political decisions. So I find these 2 points really interesting, and also the point that Jane makes on whether how that relates to democracy, the argument on whether social accountability makes the state superfluous at the end of the day, and how that impacts the role of the state. So I would agree that this is a huge topic, and the literature on the move towards social accountability or demand-side accountability, this is a term that the World Bank uses, really weakens the role of the state for regulation.
Thank you, Gita. I saw a hand earlier from Tony and Rie. Am I correct? Tony and then Rie? Yes.
Thank you. Let me first thanks give a great appreciation to our discussants for the great comments and reading carefully our work. I really appreciate it. And on the concept of accountability, to me, and from the perspective of my chapter at least, I think it's important to highlight that is not a performance-based accountability is not a policy instrument. Is a system with different components, and each component can have different instruments. And the 3 components, in my view, but also according to the literature, is that first you need some form of performance assessment. Second, you need to an information system. So what you do with this performance data, who is being informed, how, through which reporting system, whether this information is publicly available only for schools and families, etc., etc. And then a third key component of accountability, and is core in the definition of accountability, is some form of consequence. This consequence can be more formative, reflexive, but can also be more in the form of economic incentives, rewards, punishment, etc., etc. So all these 3 components combine in different ways, and they can produce very different approaches to the same category of performance-based accountability. What I try to highlight in the chapter is that each of these components can evolve differently across time. And not only the components and the instruments and how they are specifically designed can evolve in different ways, sometimes in contradictory ways, through public regulation. What is interesting of performance-based accountability is that also informal regulations, informal uses can shape the meaning and the trajectory of performance-based accountability. So what I show in the chapter is how sometimes local media is publishing results in a way that is not expected or is not authorized by national authorities, but is generating some performative effects. The same happened with inspection services, that because it's useful for them, they use performance data to evaluate the schools, even if that's not the mandated use of this type of performance data. So I want to highlight this let's say multidimensional definition of performance-based accountability from a policy perspective, but also how interesting is this policy let's say assemblage from a perspective of instrumentation, because of the different actors that can be involved in its evolution and reception at the school level.
Thank you, Tony. And Rie, I know that you had your hand up for my previous question. And in addition to what you were going to share, if I may add one more question, not question, but the point drawing on the points from the commentators. There was one point made about who's going to be responsible for accountability and how the burden of accountability is placed on different actors. And since your chapter talks about different levels, I thought if you could also share a few short reflection on that point as well, in addition to what you were going to originally share. Thank you, Rie.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. That's actually a really wonderful segue, because that was exactly what I wanted to respond to. That was posed by Jane and followed up by Patrick. And I think in conclusion, also reflects to what John mentioned, the big question of what happens. Who are we accountable for? using data for accountability in the post-liberal era. So one of the things that came to mind as Jane was talking about the concept of principal agent moral hazard in education, when we apply the notion of assessments, we can certainly think about the state having more control and more information. And the students, maybe the school, the teachers don't have a lot of that information that that the state might have. So in the chapter that we worked on for this, the number of counts related to accountability and assessment accountability reforms was that you see this large increase in student and teacher assessments. So that's posing a lot of stress on the education system, partly because the government wants to have more information about what the students are learning, how they're performing, whether the teachers know the content, the subject area that they are so quote unquote specialized. And as a result, there is this sense that, yes, we have more information that the government has gained through auditing of the education system, but there could be potential negative consequences as a result of having to assess teachers and students, which might result in firing of teachers. That the fact that maybe some teachers are not performing very well could result in negative consequences. So the intent of assessments is always positive. Let's audit, let's make sure that the education system is improving over time. But perhaps there are also negative consequences that also come from the notion of moral hazard that could be happening within the system of education. So that, I think, is one way in which I think we could, and I would love to explore more through additional research on that end.
Thank you so much. Kirsten, and same for VA, I will also add one additional point for your reflection, which is about one of the very first points raised by Patrick about how the concept of accountability is actually practiced within international organizations. Since your chapter also addresses the international organizations, if you could also reflect on that a bit, in addition to your original comments, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so when it comes to, well, Kirsten, you probably have insights on the international organization. So I'll wait until Kirsten, you speak, and maybe I'll add a little bit more information there.
Yes.
Thank you, Shannon. Actually, that relates very much to what I wanted to say anyway. But first of all, thank you a lot for the comments. I totally agree with Geeta. You know, we should have sessions like this in between before publishing a book. Although I wonder whether we will actually ever publish the book then, because you can always continue, you know, collecting comments. Well, what I found very interesting about Jane's comments was that, in a way, I think all of us presented results of large research we did over the last couple of years in big projects and related it to the overall frame, whereas Jane said, oh, this is a fantastic research agenda for the future, in a way. So it also means that, you know, we never come to an end. So it's always a reflection of what's going on, and that also relates to what Patrick said about, you know, useless data, about private actors. So in a way, I'm already thinking about volume 2 and 3 in this regard. But getting back to the issue of accountability, what I wanted to say, in addition to what Tumi already said very well, I think accountability always involves at least 2 actors, because it's about reporting, it's about monitoring. And accountability also means that the actors involved believe in accountability, because otherwise it doesn't really have any effect. And as a third edition, accountability can take place on the same level of actors. So that's what we very often call peer reviewing, or it could also take place between actors on different levels. And that's a bit what my chapter is about, in the sense that I looked at accountability mechanisms by international organizations, where most often, of course, the member states or states in general are the addressee of these accountability mechanisms. And here I think John's comment really made me think about the decline of liberalism. So what's the future of accountability mechanisms? In my case, on the international level. So if states like the US decline from international organizations, or they don't take them seriously anymore, or they somehow interpret the meaning of an organization in a different way. I'm thinking about Trump and NATO here, of course, so it's not related to education as such. But so I'm wondering how these, let's say, long established accountability mechanisms, and I apologize here, so I only have like maybe 2 decades to look back and not many like John or Gita, but how these accountability mechanisms, do they keep holding and can support the system of learning, of mutual learning in a way, or whether we need to really pay attention to this issue.
Thank you, Kirsten. Rie?
Great. Yes, just to add a little bit about the notion of international organizations and how they have also structured this global discourse and governance around assessment is also a very important element that defines how we have conceptualized and how countries have responded to assessments, that there's a very strong global force through OECD's work in PISA, through IEA's work in TIMSS and PEARLS and other types of international assessments, in that they have created norms and standards that the countries should and ought to follow. But we also see many ways in which countries are also comparing one another. So that's one component that we were able to find from this particular work, is that countries are actually referring to one another, stating other countries that might not necessarily be very similar to their country in both cultural, societal, economic factors, and that they're referencing these countries in national education reform or policies. So it's quite interesting that policy borrowing, which is the term Gita has been working on and has really influenced the way that we think about how policies are transferred from one country to another. That notion is very strong, and you can actually see this increase over time as well.
Thank you, Rie. I think the discussants have raised so many interesting points for the authors to engage with, and I am disappointed that we don't have enough time to engage with all of them. But let me just quickly go back to the last point made by Kirsten, because and this is the main point that John raised, and I think it'll be a good way to kind of wrap up this part of the discussion, which is about what will be the future of datafication? What do you anticipate? If any of you would like to share a few words on that? Yes, Tricia?
Sure. So what I believe I see in the data is this increasing use of data tools as forms of accountability in that the belief that we can continuously measure and report everything, I mean, sort of in real time, someone raised the point, um, as more and more part of the practices of education, with this idea that comes to replace autonomy and responsibility, that somehow if we can continuously and more precisely measure more and more dimensions of teaching and learning, that then we don't need responsible actors. And despite much criticism of that sort of theory of change and learning, that seems to be the direction things are headed, in my view. So less autonomy, responsibility, and more accountability and assessment, even in the face of great criticism of that theory of change.
Thank you, Tricia. Yes, Kita?
I want to pick up and also then come back to this one. The point that Patrick made about that not all data is collected for accountability purposes and not accountability measures are based on data. And I think I completely agree. And there is something to be said about the performative nature of data. And there's a different type of scholarship that looks at data infrastructure, how once you collect data, you have professionals that deal with data, that visualize data, that interpret data, that collect data. You have structures and professions and values associated with data. How, for example, but within that, our book looks at the use of data for accountability purposes. The data is also used for all kinds of other purposes, for example, and this is where my Swiss Germanic nature comes to play. We always look into justification and legitimacy issues. It's also used for political legitimacy. For example, my beloved mayor of New York, Mamdani, made a lot of political promises and now looks into data and asks for experts to calculate the cost of free childcare and free public service and all that. So, and that's definitely for political legitimacy issues to make decisions whether it works or doesn't work in retroactive for political actions. So, however, and this is the point I think Jane also made, the term accountability, and this is what the wonderful word database shows that Stanford and Toronto, or in other words, Patricia and Ria put together. The word accountability doesn't even show up before the 1990s. It's a term in education that came up in the 1990s. And so how are we to interpret that? Maybe we should interpret it, and that's the way the authors do it in this book, that has become like an expectation, like even if you don't do it, but you have to say that you're doing it, and it has become a norm. I would say it has become a norm to have evidence-based policy making. Even if you don't do it, you have to say it that you do it, and that's again, it shows that it has taken on a life of its own. But I would love to hear the commentators more also, not just the authors, but it's up to you.
Thank you, Kita. Tony?
Yeah, out of John's comments, I really find very suggesting the idea of what is doing the decline of liberal authority to assessment, accountability, but also to other education policies. And I think that here there's some work to do when it comes to look at the political determinants of educational reform. I think that the databases produced by Bremen, Stanford can be very helpful. Now we are also working on something similar from Barcelona to look at the evolution of not only assessment but also curriculum, teacher, and inclusion policy in the last years. And I think that here we can also look at the role of different political regimes and whether they are able to introduce new policy emphases, or there is path dependence, or there is conflict resisting certain changes. So that's very important. But I would also like to address some of the great comments that Patrick was making. Actually, he has a comment on the concept of SAWA that I think is very important to understand school autonomy with accountability together in a way. If schools have to be responsive to performance outcomes, they need more autonomy. That's how this idea has emerged. And actually, if we look at international data, effectively, those educational systems with more stringent accountability regimes are also those that have more school autonomy in terms of curriculum and staffing. But interestingly, at the macro level, this goes together. But when you look at the micro level, in more, let's say, empirical research in schools, and this maybe connects to the concept of commensuration, those schools, those teachers that experience more performance pressure, they are usually those that perceive that they have less professional autonomy, less autonomy at the curriculum level, at the methodology level. So maybe there is a trade-off at the micro level that we don't see at the more meso and macro level. And this brings to the very important concept of commensuration, because commensuration is doing a lot to key educational notions that we are using, whether it's learning, whether it's school quality, whether it's education equity. So it's simplifying in a way the meaning, but is also in a way affecting the behavior of key school actors, sometimes narrowing the curriculum, teaching to the test. So this is also something that is very important, connected to the idea of conflict. So how sometimes professional bodies respond to this through conflict. But I think that maybe we need to bring more conflict into the analysis, not only to think about how accountability reform generates conflict in the educational field, but also how accountability is also a response, a policy response to other types of educational conflict. And this is what we observe in Chile. The accountability system is expanding and the different instruments configuring it in a way because accountability has been portrayed as the best way to address, let's say, market failure in a highly privatized educational system. So you can see how conflict plays in different ways in the accountability reform debate, which again, I think is why it's making it so relevant and so interesting from a political sociology perspective.
Thank you so much, Tony. I have been reading the comments that were shared that have been shared in the chat box as well as the Q&A box, and I actually think that a lot of these questions were covered partly by different answers and responses that have been shared by the authors. But let me just quickly draw your attention to one particular question that we can address before we conclude the event. This is a question from Ian, who said, I'm curious what the author saw with regards to the domains that are seen as legitimate for data-driven accountability practices in education systems / global education. There is, of course, concern with assessment and skills competencies, etc., which I think we have covered in our responses. But for example, in some contexts, we see datafication with regards to student behavior. I ask partly because we might think about the changing or expanding roles that schools are playing in society and thus what schools might be asked to account for. For example, reducing violence, teenage pregnancy, and etc. So did you discuss or notice anything during your work about in terms of the coverage of accountability in data? And if you can share a brief answer on this point, that would be wonderful. Anyone among the authors?
Maybe I can speak a little bit to this. Thank you so much for that question. When it comes to, so we haven't looked into specific components related to maybe violence or other elements in the database, but what I have noticed is that there's a lot more notions related to learners' agency. So this is actually not just my observation, but one of our team members from our Word team is looking at the increases of social emotional component, which is something that John has also mentioned earlier in his remark. That perhaps maybe notions of the learner's agency, maybe creativity, sort of the notions that are aside from the actual subject area knowledge are also appearing in the database. And so there are some studies that are looking into this in more detail, and hopefully the papers will come out so that we can share them with all of you. So I think those are some elements that come to mind. Of course, in terms of international assessments, OECD is now embarking on a creativity assessment across different countries. And so this, I think, is quite linked to what John asked initially about what happens in this post-liberal era, that perhaps maybe we're moving away from the notions that we think are quite structured around academic capabilities to thinking about the child more holistically. And perhaps maybe that might be in alignment with what we're conceptualizing in the way that we want to think about each child's development. So that comes to mind. But on the other hand, perhaps maybe there is also this disbelief of data that Patrick referenced, the rise of populism around the world. And perhaps maybe people are not taking data seriously and maybe might decline over time. So it would be quite interesting to see that shift happening, and whether our database or maybe other scholar, Tony, you talked about your database, and perhaps maybe that might work out in our analysis down the road of more recent trends that we might see from notions of public accountability.
Thank you, Rie. So there could be a book number 2 in 10 years, right? On this topic, hopefully. So thank you so much for all your insights and comments, commentators, and the authors. And based on the rich comments and discussions we have had today, now I'm very delighted to share that the book is officially available, open access. Allison, could you share the slide? You can read and download it using the QR code on the screen right here. While the book is freely available online, if you would like to purchase a physical copy of the book, the publisher is actually offering a 35% discount on their website until the end of May. So please use this code if you're interested in purchasing a physical copy. But once again, this book is open access. You can read and download it freely online. Before we conclude, I would like to highlight 2 upcoming events at NORAC and also one research opportunity. There will be various regional launches of NSI 10, Education for Societal Transformation, Alternative for a Just Future. We have different regional versions of NSI 10, and they will have various different regional launch dates for this. So please use this QR code to check the dates of regional launches. And then another event will be Policy Insight launch on May 13th. This is about Beyond 2030, what role for higher education in the new global agenda. I highly encourage that you attend this very important and interesting event as well. And finally, there is a PhD researcher opportunity in International Relations and Political Science Department at the Geneva Graduate Institute. So you can use this QR code to learn more about the position. And if you are interested in, please do apply before the deadline. With that, we warmly invite you to join our network to stay engaged with our work and activities. I would also like to draw your attention to the South Also Knows initiatives. And this initiative aims to help rebalance the global flow of expertise and decision making. So please sign up and join us using these QR codes. All participants will receive a follow-up email with the event recording, key highlights, and the link to the publication. And in the meantime, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. So please let us know how we can improve our events by completing the evaluation form. The links are going to be shared with you in the chat. With that, thank you so much to our speakers, commentators, and authors for such a rich and engaging discussion. I wish we can continue discussing. And most importantly, thank you all of you for joining us today. And I would also like to extend many thanks to the organizing team at NORAC and the KICS EMAP Hub, as well as our co-sponsors, the Stanford University Graduate School of Education, the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and the Master's Program in Education Policies for Global Development and Teachers College, Columbia University. We hope you enjoyed the session and look forward to continuing the conversation in future events. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.